is what we're facing genuinely a crisis of trust, or is it something different, perhaps better expressed as an explosion of anger? We've got all the evidence, of course, that shows from surveys. There was a Gallup poll last year that showed that confidence in banks had collapsed from 47% a decade ago to 24% last year. Since the financial crisis broke here, only 8% of UK bank retail customers have actually chosen to move their current accounts elsewhere. Banks, even today, still retain an exceptionally loyal or at least captive customer base, however aggrieved it may feel. It does seem that collectively, as retail customers, we trust the bank's bookkeeping, but not their values. And a key question for our panel this evening is how sustainable is this captive loyalty for the future?
If you have to have a detailed and complex set of rules with expensive monitoring, you have the wrong business or regulatory model. It will have serious dysfunctional consequences. Basel III is bound to fail. Too complex. Unless they contrive some simple rules, the capital required regime will fail as it has failed in the last 10 years. Most of us invest in a pension fund. This pension fund used to invest our money in-house. It now outsources the investment process to an asset manager. Because we don't trust the asset manager, we require it to outsource the holding of money and the holding of assets to a custodian. They must all be paid, and they all increase transaction costs. Worse than that, they disperse responsibility.
We have really, in some ways, a very busted system. Incentive systems are a joke. They're based upon a completely false model of human motivation, and they don't work. We have hierarchies where people compete for positions because that's a kind of a boys' kind of gaming system of competitive hierarchies, and we pretend it works, and it doesn't work, because what you then get is people going to leadership positions who have no interest in leading, just because they want to be higher in the pile. And we have so-called accountabilities, which put people in a bubble and say, you're responsible for this, but if you see anything else outside that's going wrong, that's not your business. There is a big problem in financial services because there isn't a proper model of management. So we do need some kind of new model based upon returning to some of the fundamentals about how you can create cycles of real trust and value within human communities.
I'd like to see the re-establishment of relationships based on a desire to be considered decent and honourable, and an intolerance of anything that falls short of that, and a comfort with the fact that being decent and honourable sometimes has financial cost, but brings great value. I would like to see proportionality of reward and a fair distribution of risk. I'd like to see an acceptance that we take responsibility for our actions. I'd like to see a culture of restraint and exemplary leadership by example by those at the top of our major organizations. I'd like to see an intolerance of too big to fail or too interconnected to fail. I'd like to see the end of offshore tax havens which have facilitated the theft from some of the poorest in the world. Thank you.
It's no coincidence that the professions that are most trusted are the caring professions, doctors, nurses, teachers. My hypothesis is that for business to regain trust, it needs to start to care, and I think that's particularly true of banks. Business starts and ends with a customer, and so for me the real crisis of trust lies in the fact that over the last 20 years banks have forgotten to care about their customers. And Handelsbanken is a Swedish bank that's been opening branches in the UK at the rate of about one every 10 days for the last year or so. The bank has 9 cornerstones of business, and the first cornerstone, wait for it, is that meeting customers is the key to Handelsbanken's operations. Well, of course, the contrast is that most UK banks operate a business model in which it couldn't be harder to meet customers. I do think but the banks that come out on top will be those that start to demonstrate care.
So Andy Haldane, who's the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, they have a little sort of think tank part of the Bank of England, does excellent research. Thought he'd have a look at whether Basel I or Basel III would have been better at predicting the banks that got themselves into trouble in 2008. Would the simple regulatory regime have been better, or was the complex one better? Well, the first thing he discovered was that neither of them predicted very well whether or not banks were going to go down, which is quite a problem. But also, he discovered that Basel I, the simple regulation, actually did the job better than did the complex regulation. If we make the system very, very, very complex, what we do is only those people inside the system who understand the complexity will be able to understand it. And if we tell them that there are incentives to be profitable by gaming the system, that's what they'll do.
Where do you think this change is going to come from? It's wanted, it's recognised, it's necessary, but from where?
None of this moral improvement is going to happen unless the men and women at the top of these banks say, we are going to drive for change. We're not going to accept those terrible behaviours which have cost the world so much. I unfortunately see very, very, very little evidence of that happening.
Either we have, as I've tried to explain, really vast numbers of systemic reforms across the piece, or else this will be solved when we have another crisis and the anger boils over.